My name is Clara, and I have a story to tell. A story that may shock some, and perhaps make others question my choices. But this is my truth. One I've kept hidden for so long. Now I feel it's finally time to come clean. Let me start by saying, this isn't some wild tale of scandal or outrageous behavior. It's about love, loneliness, and how a simple connection can go so unexpectedly wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning. My husband James and I have been married for nearly a decade. We met fresh out of college. He was ambitious, charming, and the kind of man who could walk into any room and instantly draw everyone's attention. I fell hard for him, and those early days were like a dream. Straight out of a romance movie. But fast forward a few years, and life wasn't so picture perfect anymore. James's work demanded more of him each year, often taking him away from home for business trips, conferences, and endless networking events. I understood how important his job was, but his absences took a toll on our marriage. We grew distant, barely talking for days. And when we did, the conversations felt shallow. Just the usual, how was your day or what's for dinner? Beneath it all, I felt so lonely, craving attention, companionship, someone to fill the void James had unknowingly left in my life. We lived on a quiet, peaceful farm outside the city, a place we chose in for its space and the chance to keep animals. We had a few chickens, a couple of goats, and of course, our horse Thunder. Thunder was a majestic, gentle, bay stallion with an intuitive nature that made it seem as if he understood emotions better than most people. I'd always loved horses, and Thunder was special. He'd been a gift from James on our 5th anniversary, a gesture to show he cared even when he couldn't always be there. During the long, lonely days when James was away, Thunder became my comfort. I spent hours in the stable brushing him, talking to him, simply being with him. It may sound strange, but animals have a way of sensing when you're hurting. Thunder seemed to know whenever I felt down or frustrated. He'd nudge me gently as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." Over time, these moments with Thunder became the highlight of my days. I pour my heart out to him, sharing things I couldn't even express to my own husband. I know it sounds strange. How could I compare a horse to my husband? But you have to understand, James was absent and Thunder was all I had. The turning point came one summer evening. James was out of town as usual, and I was feeling particularly low. I just finished a phone call with him, and once again, it felt like we were two strangers leading separate lives. So I went out to the stable, hoping to find peace with Thunder. As I brushed his coat, I started venting, talking about my frustrations, my loneliness, how disconnected I felt from James. I was speaking without thinking, when suddenly I realized I was talking about Thunder in a way that made my heart race. I caught myself, shook my head, and laughed it off. "Clara, you're being ridiculous," I told myself. Thunder was a horse, a magnificent one, yes, but still just a horse. I tried to brush off the strange thoughts creeping into my mind, but as days went on, I found myself returning to the stable more and more often. I lingered longer than I should, feeling a growing sense of attachment I couldn't explain. I felt guilty. How could I be so emotionally invested in an animal when I had a husband? But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger the connection became. Thunder was always there, and James, well, he wasn't. The truth is, I wasn't cheating in the usual sense. There was no physical betrayal, no affair, not in the traditional sense. But emotionally, I'd crossed a line, confiding in Thunder in ways that should have been reserved for my husband. Then one evening, everything came crashing down. James came home unexpectedly from one of his trips. I hadn't heard his car pull into the driveway, and I was in the stable with Thunder, unaware of the time. I was so caught up in the strange, Attachment, that I didn't notice James's presence until it was too late. "What are you doing?" James's voice cut through the stillness, sharp with confusion and suspicion. His eyes flickered between me and Thunder, as if trying to piece together what he was seeing. I froze, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to say. How can I possibly explain this without sounding completely irrational? Richard stood there staring. Waiting for an explanation I wasn't sure how to give. How could I even begin to explain the emotional whirlwind? "I've been caught in..." The silence in the stable stretched on endlessly, broken only by the soft snorts of midnight, oblivious to the storm he unwittingly caused. "Jessica, what the hell is going on?" Richard asked, his voice a mix of confusion and anger. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing, clearly trying to make sense of what he was seeing. I took a step back, instinctively placing a hand on Midnight's side, as if he could somehow shield me from the confrontation I knew was coming. "It's not what you think, Richard." I stammered, though I wasn't even sure what he thought yet. How could I explain what he was witnessing when I barely understood it myself? Richard shook his head, unconvinced. "Then tell me I come home early and find you here." Whispering to our horse like he's... I don't even know, what am I supposed to think? I took a deep breath, searching for words to explain the emotional connection I developed with Midnight without sounding completely irrational. "Richard, you've been gone a lot lately." I began, already seeing the frustration building in his eyes. "I know it's for work, and I know you're working hard for us. But I've been lonely, Midnight. He's been here for me. He listened when I didn't have anyone else." Richard threw his hands up in exasperation. "He's a horse, Jessica. You're talking like he's a person." I winced, unable to deny how absurd it sounded. Even to me. "I know," I whispered. "But he was there when you weren't." I started talking to him because I didn't have anyone else. And somehow it just got out of hand. Richard's expression was a mix of disbelief and hurt. "So what are you saying, that you had an emotional affair with a horse?" The words sounded almost ridiculous, but they stung because the reality wasn't that far off. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said quietly, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "I was just so lonely, Richard. I needed someone to talk to. And Midnight was there." Richard shook his head, struggling to process it all. "So what you're telling me, you love him? That you'd rather be with him than with me?" "No, of course not," I replied quickly, stepping forward and reaching for his hand. "I love you, Richard. But I was lonely, and I made a mistake. I let my emotions get the better of me. And I turned to Midnight when I should have turned to you." He pulled his hand away, pacing back and forth in the stable. "This is insane. I don't even know how to wrap my head around this. I come home and find my wife confessing to some kind of emotional affair with our horse." I stood there helpless. "Richard, please. It wasn't like that. I didn't do anything physical. Nothing inappropriate. I got lost in the loneliness." He was silent for a moment, his back turned to me as he collected his thoughts. Then he spoke, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Do you realize how crazy this sounds, Jessica? How ridiculous this whole situation is?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but it's the truth. I let my loneliness cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry. I never meant for it to get this far." Richard turned to face me, his expression softening slightly. "Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me you were feeling this way?" "I tried," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But every time I brought it up, you were too busy or tired or distracted. Eventually, I just gave up. I thought maybe this was just how things are going to be. So I found comfort in Midnight. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but he was there for me in a way you weren't. Richard sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. I didn't know you felt this way. I thought we were fine. We weren't, I replied softly. But I didn't want to burden you with it. You were always so busy with work, and I didn't want to seem needy. But the truth is, I needed you, Richard. I needed my husband. And when you weren't there, I turned to midnight. There was a long silence as we stood there, the weight of the situation settling over us. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice after this time. I don't know what to do with this, Jessica. I don't know how to move forward. I took a deep breath, tears spilling onto my cheeks. I don't either, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I love you, and I don't want to lose you. Richard looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and uncertainty. I love you too, Jessica, but this is going to take time. I nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Richard sighed again, finally stepping closer. We need to talk about this. Really talk, not just about midnight, but about us, where we went wrong and how we can fix it. I nodded, reaching out to take his hand. This time he squeezed it back, a small gesture that felt like the first bridge over the gulf that had grown between us. I'm ready to talk, Richard. I'm ready to make things right. As we stood there in the stable, the air thick with the weight of our conversation, I realized that this was the first step toward rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. And so, Jessica and Richard began the long journey of healing their marriage, learning to reconnect and rediscover the love that had once brought them together.